In December 1941, the Pacific Ocean was a kingdom of shadows. Beneath its calm blue surface, the currents of empire and vengeance began to stay. The world's largest body of water was about to become its most violent graveyard. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had dreamed of dominance, to command the Pacific as Rome had once ruled the Mediterranean. But on the opposite side of that ocean, a sleeping giant had been struck, and it was waking up with fury in its blood. The war between Japan and the United States would not just be fought by mighty battleships or squadrons of aircraft screaming across the sky. It would be fought in the deep, where men hunted men in steel coffins, and silence was the only weapon sharper than torpedoes. This is the story of one such hunt, of how an American submarine, born in secrecy and trained in frustration, would one day strike down one of Japan's proudest warships, the aircraft carrier Shokaku. But before that fatal encounter in the summer of 1944, came years of failure, learning, and blood. The stage was not yet ready. The hunters were not yet sharp.I In the early days of the Pacific War, the United States Navy's submarine force was a weapon not yet worthy of its mission. On paper, it was formidable. More than 100 submarines spread across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. But in practice, they were plagued by flaws, flawed doctrine, flawed leadership, and flawed torpedoes. The Mark 14 torpedo, the weapon upon which every American submariner's life depended, was a disaster. It ran too deep. It failed to explode. And when it did explode, it sometimes detonated too early, revealing a submarine's position before the kill could be made. Commander after commander would return from patrols in 1942 with the same bitter report. Multiple hits, no damage. Target struck, torpedoes failed. In contrast, the Japanese Navy's doctrine was ruthless, efficient, and mercilessly trained. They had perfected the art of naval coordination. Their ships moved like a single living organism, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers synchronized by precise planning and iron discipline. Among those ships was a new kind of carrier, sleek, fast, and powerful. Her name meant soaring crane. She was Shokaku, the pride of the Imperial Navy.In Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, 1937. Her keel was laid down. Japan was not yet at war, but war was already in her soul. She would be 257 meters long, longer than 2 football fields. Her deck would hold more than 70 aircraft, the deadly Mitsubishi A6M0s, the D-3A Val dive bombers, and the B-5N-K torpedo planes, the same aircraft that would later devastate Pearl Harbor. But what made Shokaku unique was not just her size or strength. It was her philosophy. She embodied Japan's naval ideal, mobility, range, and resilience. She and her sister ship, Shokaku, were to be the twin wings of Japan's air fleet. Together, they would lead the spearhead of the empire. Her steel was forged in a time of rising tides, when Japan's empire stretched across Asia, from the Chinese coast to the islands of the South Pacific. The rising sun was not just a flag. It was an idea that Japan was destined to rule the Pacific across the ocean. The United States watched uneasily. Years of isolation had left its military underprepared. Its ships were old. Its air power, scattered. Its submarine crews, brave, but inexperienced. And then came December 7, 1941. Archival radio static, distant air raid sirens, explosions, Pearl Harbor attack sounds. The sky over Oahu turned black with smoke and burning oil. Japanese carrier aircraft, launched from Akagi, Kaga, Sarayu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, struck without warning. The attack crippled the Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, hundreds of planes destroyed, more than 2,000 sailors killed. But in that smoke and chaos, one truth emerged like a spark in darkness. The aircraft carrier was now the master of the sea. And among those masters, the Shokaku had earned her legend. Her pilots had trained relentlessly, executing coordinated torpedo runs and dive-bombing tactics that stunned American observers. While the world mourned Pearl Harbor, Shokaku's crew celebrated. They had been part of history, the strike that shattered America's illusion of safety. But what they didn't know was that the men of America's submarine fleet were listening, watching, waiting far below the surface. In the dark, claustrophobic compartments of U.S. submarines, crews were preparing for a kind of warfare no human mind was built to endure. Inside those steel tubes, space was so tight that men slept beside torpedoes. The air was heavy with diesel fumes and sweat. Every dive brought the smell of oil, the taste of metal, and the constant creak of hull plates bending under pressure. They were called the Silent Service. And though few outside the Navy knew their names, these men were about to carry the burden of vengeance for an entire nation. Their orders were clear: sink Japanese shipping, disrupt supply lines, and, if fate allowed, destroy the ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor. But success would not come easily. The early years of the war were brutal for American submariners. Mechanical failures, missed opportunities, and defective weapons nearly broke their spirit. Many patrols ended with no sinkings, no triumphs, just exhaustion and quiet despair. Yet through it all, a few commanders began to learn. They studied Japanese convoy routes. They adapted to enemy tactics. And slowly, the hunters of the deep began to sharpen their teeth. For the Japanese Navy, victory seemed unstoppable. After Pearl Harbor came the conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The rising sun swept across the Pacific like a wildfire. By early 1942, Japan's empire was larger than it had ever been. But victory carried with it an illusion, the illusion of invincibility. The Japanese high command began to believe that the Americans were broken, that their industrial might and morale had been shattered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, knew better. He had studied in America. He had seen its factories, its energy, its resilience. And he warned his superiors: for 6 months to a year after the war begins, I will run wild, but I have no expectation of success in a long war. He was right. Those 6 months would define Japan's highest glory and plant the seeds of its ultimate defeat. Among the instruments of that glory, Shokaku stood proud. She and Shokaku formed the elite of Japan's carrier force, the 5th Carrier Division. They were the sharp edge of every major operation, from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. And it was there, in the Coral Sea, that Shokaku would first meet the wrath of the United States. The Coral Sea, May 1942. 2 carrier fleets would face each other for the first time in history, without ever sighting each other's ships directly. Aircraft would be the new artillery, pilots, the new gunners. And from that moment forward, the sea would belong to whoever ruled the sky. The Shokaku SA groups attacked with deadly precision, crippling the carrier USS Lexington and damaging USS Yorktown. But victory came at a price. American dive bombers struck back, one after another, screaming out of the clouds. Shokaku took 3 direct hits. Her flight deck was torn open, her hangars burning, her crew fighting to keep her afloat. She limped back to Japan, her hull scarred, her spirit unbroken. In that smoke-filled aftermath, her sailors learned their first taste of fear. The Americans were not broken. They were coming back, stronger, faster, and angrier. For months afterward, Shokaku disappeared into dry dock at Yokosuka. Welders worked day and night, sealing her wounds, reforging her steel. When she emerged, she was faster, more heavily armored, and deadlier than before. By 1943, she was again ready for war. But the tide of the Pacific was shifting. New submarines, faster, quieter, deadlier, were now prowling the sea lanes. Among them, one boat that would one day make history: USS Cavalla, SS-244, a Gato-class submarine, commissioned in February 1944. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, was calm, calculating, and relentless. He had trained his crew to move like clockwork. No wasted motion, no unnecessary noise. They were hunters, not tourists. And though Cavalla was still untested in combat, her moment would come, when fate placed her in the path of Shokaku. But before that final encounter, the Pacific would see the bloodiest aerial battle of the war. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The hunters were ready. The prey was proud. And the ocean was waiting before Shokaku roared across the Pacific skies. Before her name would be whispered with fear by sailors on both sides of the ocean, she was a dream cast in steel. In 1937, Japan's naval engineers and architects began planning a carrier unlike any before it. The world's oceans were not waiting for her, yet the empire intended to make them obey. Her keel, laid at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, marked the birth of a new kind of warship, a living weapon, a floating city, and a symbol of national pride. Shokaku, meaning soaring crane, was envisioned as a carrier capable of sustaining long-range strikes, dominating the skies, and surviving the chaos of modern naval warfare. Designed to carry 84 aircraft, she would serve as the spearhead of Japan's carrier strike force. Her hull displaced over 30,000 tons. Her flight deck stretched 257 meters, nearly 2.5 football fields. 4 powerful turbines would give her a speed of 34 knots, faster than most cruisers. Her construction demanded precision. Every rivet hammered into the hull was inspected. Every panel measured and polished. The engineers understood the stakes. This was more than a ship. It was the embodiment of Japan's destiny. While steel and engines gave Shokaku strength, it was a crew that gave her life. Captain Taketsugajima, a veteran officer, understood the philosophy of a carrier better than most. He believed the ship itself was alive. Her engines the heart, her deck the skin, her crew the blood. Her pilots were elite. Graduates of Japan's rigorous flight schools, they endured weeks of training on short wooden flight decks, mastering takeoffs, landings, and aerial combat maneuvers. Among them were future legends Saburo Sakai, Shigeru Ataya, and Takeo Tanamizu. They trained not just to fly, but to become extensions of the ship. Their Zeros and dive bombers were not tools, they were limbs, wings of the crane itself. WWII 1941, Shokaku's construction was complete. Her decks gleamed under the sun, polished to mirror the sky. On board, deck crews prepared aircraft, tested engines, and trained relentlessly. The ship became a theater of coordinated precision. Ordnance crews armed bombs and torpedoes in synchronization. Pilots ran through pre-flight drills, adjusting harnesses and instruments. Deck officers signaled with flags, maintaining rhythm amidst the clamor of activity. It was a choreography of steel and human effort, a living embodiment of Japanese naval doctrine. Shokaku's first sea trials were flawless. She cut through Yokosuka Bay like a blade, her turbines singing a song of power and promise. She was joined by her sister ship, Shokaku, forming the 5th Carrier Division. Together, they became the Empire's twin wings, a force capable of striking anywhere in the Pacific. Her reputation grew rapidly. She was more than a ship. She was a symbol, celebrated in newspapers, films, and public ceremonies. By late 1941, the drums of war grew louder. Japan faced an embargo from the United States, strangling its access to oil and steel. Military leaders decided that expansion, conquest, and preemptive strikes were the only path to survival. Shokaku's crew received sealed orders, their target, the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The tension aboard was tangible. Pilots wrote farewell letters, sharpened knives, and prayed in the ship's Shinto shrine. Captain Jimmy's orders were simple. The Empire must strike first. Fly true. Return if you can. On November 26, 1941, Shokaku and the 5th Carrier Division slipped into the open Pacific under cover of night. For 12 days, they steamed silently, avoiding detection, preparing for the largest naval strike the world had ever seen. Below decks, sonar operators and navigation crews plotted courses with meticulous care. Every movement was calculated. Every engine hum was monitored. On the morning of December 7th, Shokaku's aircraft lifted into the dawn sky. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and Zero fighters streaked toward Oahu, executing the meticulously planned assault. The attack crippled battleships, destroyed aircraft, and killed thousands. Shokaku's pilots returned, exhausted but victorious. Though the Japanese celebrated, they underestimated the resilience of their enemy. Across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy's submarine force quietly began its transformation, learning, adapting, preparing for the day it would strike back. The first months of 1942 tested Shokaku's crew and her capabilities. The Coral Sea, Midway, and other early battles exposed weaknesses, aircraft losses, damage from counterattacks, and the limitations of carrier warfare became clear. Yet, Shokaku emerged stronger. Her hangars repaired, her deck reinforced, her air groups retrained. The pride of Japan, the soaring crane, was ready for the next chapter. Shokaku had been born into destiny, trained for war, and baptized in fire. But the ocean remembers, and beneath its depths, the hunters of the deep were already sharpening their teeth. For the Japanese Navy, victory seemed unstoppable. After Pearl Harbor came the conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The rising sun swept across the Pacific like a wildfire. By early 1942, Japan's empire was larger than it had ever been. But victory carried with it an illusion, the illusion of invincibility. The Japanese High Command began to believe that the Americans were broken, that their industrial might and morale had been shattered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, knew better. He had studied in America. He had seen its factories, its energy, its resilience. And he warned his superiors, "For 6 months to a year after the war begins, I will run wild, but I have no expectation of success in a long war." He was right. Those 6 months would define Japan's highest glory and plant the seeds of its ultimate defeat. Among the instruments of that glory, Shokaku stood proud. She and Shokaku formed the elite of Japan's carrier force, the 5th Carrier Division. They were the sharp edge of every major operation, from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. And it was there, in the Coral Sea, that Shokaku would first meet the wrath of the United States. The Coral Sea, May 1942. 2 carrier fleets would face each other for the first time in history, without ever sighting each other's ships directly. Aircraft would be the new artillery, pilots the new gunners, and from that moment forward, the sea would belong to whoever ruled the sky. The Shokaku SA groups attacked with deadly precision, crippling the carrier USS Lexington and damaging USS Yorktown. But victory came at a price. American dive bombers struck back, one after another, screaming out of the clouds. Shokaku took 3 direct hits. Her flight deck was torn open, her hangars burning, her crew fighting to keep her afloat. She limped back to Japan, her hull scarred, her spirit unbroken. In that smoke-filled aftermath, her sailors learned their first taste of fate. The Americans were not broken. They were coming back, stronger, faster, and angrier. For months afterward, Shokaku disappeared into dry dock at Yokosuka. Welders worked day and night, sealing her wounds, reforging her steel. When she emerged, she was faster, more heavily armored, and deadlier than before. By 1943, she was again ready for war. But the tide of the Pacific was shifting. New submarines, faster, quieter, deadlier, were now prowling the sea lanes. Among them, one boat that would one day make history, USS Cavalla, SS-244, a Gato-class submarine, commissioned in February 1944. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, was calm, calculating, and relentless. He had trained his crew to move like clockwork, no wasted motion, no unnecessary noise. They were hunters, not tourists. And though Cavalla was still untested in combat, her moment would come, when fate placed her in the path of Shokaku. But before that final encounter, the Pacific would see the bloodiest aerial battle of the war. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The hunters were ready. The prey was proud. And the ocean was waiting before Shokaku roared across the Pacific skies. Before her name would be whispered with fear by sailors on both sides of the ocean, she was a dream cast in steel. In 1937, Japan's naval engineers and architects began planning a carrier unlike any before it. The world's oceans were not waiting for her, yet the empire intended to make them obey. Her keel, laid at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, marked the birth of a new kind of warship, a living weapon, a floating city, and a symbol of national pride. Shokaku, meaning soaring crane, was envisioned as a carrier capable of sustaining long-range strikes, dominating the skies, and surviving the chaos of modern naval warfare. Designed to carry 84 aircraft, she would serve as the spearhead of Japan's carrier strike force. Her hull displaced over 30,000 tons. Her flight deck stretched 257 meters, nearly 2.5 football fields. 4 powerful turbines would give her a speed of 34 knots, faster than most cruisers. Her construction demanded precision. Every rivet hammered into the hull was inspected, every panel measured and polished. The engineers understood the stakes. This was more than a ship. It was the embodiment of Japan's destiny. While steel and engines gave Shokaku strength, it was her crew that gave her life. Captain Taketsugajima, a veteran officer, understood the philosophy of a carrier better than most. He believed the ship itself was alive. Her engines the heart, her deck the skin, her crew the blood. Her pilots were elite. Graduates of Japan's rigorous flight schools, they endured weeks of training on short wooden flight decks, mastering takeoffs, landings, and aerial combat maneuvers. Among them were future legends, Saburo Sakai, Shigeru Ataya, and Takeo Tanemizu. They trained not just to fly, but to become extensions of the ship. Their Zeros and dive bombers were not tools, they were limbs, wings of the crane itself. WWII 1941, Shokaku's construction was complete. Her decks gleamed under the sun, polished to mirror the sky. On board, deck crews prepared aircraft, tested engines, and trained relentlessly. The ship became a theater of coordinated precision. Ordnance crews armed bombs and torpedoes in synchronization. Pilots ran through pre-flight drills, adjusting harnesses and instruments. Deck officers signaled with flags, maintaining rhythm amidst the clamor of activity. It was a choreography of steel and human effort, a living embodiment of Japanese naval doctrine that Shokaku's first sea trials were flawless. She cut through Yokosuka Bay like a blade, her turbine singing a song of power and promise. She was joined by her sister ship, Shokaku, forming the 5th Carrier Division. Together, they became the Empire's twin wings, a force capable of striking anywhere in the Pacific. Her reputation grew rapidly. She was more than a ship. She was a symbol, celebrated in newspapers, films, and public ceremonies. By late 1941, the drums of war grew louder. Japan faced an embargo from the United States, strangling its access to oil and steel. Military leaders decided that expansion, conquest, and preemptive strikes were the only path to survival. Shokaku's crew received sealed orders, their target, the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The tension aboard was tangible. Pilots wrote farewell letters, sharpened knives, and prayed in the ship's Shinto shrine. Captain Jimmy's orders were simple. The Empire must strike first. Fly true. Return if you can. On November 26, 1941, Shokaku and the 5th Carrier Division slipped into the open Pacific under cover of night. For 12 days, they steamed silently, avoiding detection, preparing for the largest naval strike the world had ever seen. Below decks, sonar operators and navigation crews plotted courses with meticulous care. Every movement was calculated. Every engine hum was monitored. On the morning of December 7th, Shokaku's aircraft lifted into the dawn sky. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and Zero fighters streaked toward Oahu, executing the meticulously planned assault. The attack crippled battleships, destroyed aircraft, and killed thousands. Shokaku's pilots returned, exhausted but victorious. Though the Japanese celebrated, they underestimated the resilience of their enemy. Across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy's submarine force quietly began its transformation, learning, adapting, preparing for the day it would strike back. The first months of 1942 tested Shokaku's crew and her capabilities. The Coral Sea, Midway, and other early battles exposed weaknesses, aircraft losses, damage from counterattacks, and the limitations of carrier warfare became clear. Yet, Shokaku emerged stronger, her hangars repaired, her deck reinforced, her air groups retrained. The pride of Japan, the soaring crane, was ready for the next chapter. Shokaku had been born into destiny, trained for war, and baptized in fire. But the ocean remembers, and beneath its depths, the hunters of the deep were already sharpening their teeth. The morning of December 7, 1941, changed the Pacific forever. Shokaku, though not directly involved in the first wave over Pearl Harbor, had proven her place among the elite of the Imperial Navy. Her sister ships, her air groups, and her crew had tasted victory, but the war they had unleashed was far from over. Across the Pacific, the United States Navy reeled. Battleships lay in ruin, aircraft destroyed, sailors dead. Yet in the shadows beneath the waves, the silent service began to stay. Submarines, once considered auxiliary, now became instruments of vengeance. Commanders studied Japan's new strategies, plotted patrol zones, and learned from early mistakes. Every failed torpedo, every missed opportunity, was a lesson etched in cold steel and water. By early 1942, Japan's victory seemed unstoppable. Philippines, Malaya, Wake Island, the empire expanded like wildfire. Shokaku and Shokaku were at the heart of this sweep, launching aircraft that crushed enemy airfields, convoys, and naval forces alike. But the empire's greatest strength, her pride, also became her weakness. Shokaku's successes bred overconfidence. The U.S., despite early setbacks, began to adapt. New submarine commanders studied Japanese shipping lanes, learned patterns, and gained patience. From Pearl Harbor to the South China Sea, submarines became a persistent, unseen threat. And the carriers, pride of the empire, were the ultimate targets. May 4–8, 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the first engagement where aircraft, not ships, determined the outcome. Shokaku SA groups struck with precision, crippling USS Lexington and damaging Yorktown. For the first time, Japanese carriers were tested by American naval aviation. Though the Japanese believed the battle a victory, the cost was severe. Shokaku herself took direct hits. Hangars were damaged. Aircraft lost. Crews injured. It was the first inkling that America was adapting, learning the deadly calculus of carrier warfare. June 4 to 7, 1942. Midway, where ambition met fate. Shokaku was part of the larger carrier fleet, poised to strike at Midway Atoll. Her air groups readied for attacks, pilots drilled for precision, and the ship herself bristled with anticipation. But American intelligence had broken Japanese codes. Ambushes awaited. Aircraft from USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown descended on the carriers with ferocity. In the chaos, Japanese losses mounted. Akagi, Kaga, Sarayu, and Hiryu were sunk. Shokaku escaped damage, but her sister ship, Zuikaku, lost most of her air groups. Victory had slipped from Japan's grasp. The pride of the Imperial Navy now carried the memory of near catastrophe. While Shokaku recovered in dry dock, the American submarine fleet was evolving. Commanders like Herman Kossler, future captain of USS Cavalla, honed tactics, stealthy approaches, night surface attacks, coordinated wolfpack strikes. Failures of 1942 became lessons of 1943 and 1944. The silent service began to strike fear into Japanese shipping lanes, laying the groundwork for the day when even mighty carriers like Shokaku could be vulnerable beneath the waves. By late 1943, Shokaku had been repaired, reinforced, and retrained. Her crew had grown in experience, her air groups were at full strength, and her name carried legend across the Pacific. Yet in the depths, American submarines prowled like sharks. USS Cavalla and her sisters were being deployed into the Western Pacific, hunting the very ships that had struck Pearl Harbor. Every journey, every convoy, every sortie carried risk. For Shokaku, every wave was a shadow, and in that shadow, the hunters waited. At USS Cavalla, SS-244, a Gato-class submarine, patrolled the Western Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, meticulous and patient, studied Japanese carrier movements. Shokaku, with Zuikaku, Akagi, and others, became his primary target. Cavalla's crew, young and disciplined, prepared for the encounter of their lives. Every sonar ping, every torpedo tube check, every log entry was a step toward history. The chase was long, the ocean vast, but fate often favors patience. And beneath the waves, the soaring crane, Japan's pride, was about to meet the silent vengeance of the deep. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, through Coral Sea and Midway, the Pacific had been tested. Shokaku had survived, triumphant yet scarred. Her name inspired fear across the seas, yet her greatest challenge lay ahead. Beneath her prow, in darkness cold and deep, the hunters of America waited, ready to strike. And the stage was set for one of the most dramatic encounters of the Pacific War. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific had become a chessboard of steel and fire. The Imperial Japanese Navy still commanded respect, its carriers feared across thousands of miles of ocean. But the tide was changing. Beneath the waves, the United States Navy's silent service had learned the lessons of early failures. Their torpedoes had been recalibrated. Their crews had been trained in patience, stealth, and precision. And among them, a single submarine prepared for a strike that would echo through history. USS Cavalla, a Gato-class boat, prowled the Western Pacific like a shadow. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, was calm, meticulous, and relentless. Every maneuver, every sonar reading, every torpedo tube check was a step toward destiny. Shokaku, now a veteran of countless battles, steamed with Zuikaku and other carriers as part of Japan's ongoing operations in the Marianas. Cavalla's sonar operator, young and tense, detected distant propeller noises. Bearing 270, closing fast. Kossler narrowed his eyes. That's her. That's our target. For days, Cavalla followed the fleet at a careful distance, avoiding escort destroyers, evading depth charges, and remaining undetected. Every night was a battle of nerves. Every day was spent calculating speed, course, and attack vectors. Stalking a carrier was unlike any other hunt. Shokaku's speed and size made her formidable, but the ocean was Cavalla's domain. Hey, patience was a weapon sharper than any torpedo. Kossler called his officers together in the cramped wardroom. Maps were spread across the table, plotting Shokaku's probable course. Torpedoes were double-checked, depth settings calibrated. The crew moved with silent precision. Sonar operators scanned constantly. Lookouts peered through periscopes. Engineers kept engines silent yet ready. When she turns east at dawn, we'll be in position. Wait for my mark. Every man knew the risk. Detection meant death. Success meant history. The early morning sun glinted off Shokaku's deck. Aircraft were prepared for another sortie, unaware that the ocean beneath them was alive with danger. Cavalla crept closer, submerged at periscope depth, trailing silently behind. The sonar ping of destroyers echoed in the distance. 2 escorts bearing 045, closing fast. Kossler adjusted course, timing his approach to avoid detection. Steady, wait for the turn. For hours, the submarine remained patient, the crew tense, every movement deliberate. Day to 800 hours. Shokaku altered course, unknowingly lining herself up for Cavalla's strike. Now, Kossler whispered. Torpedo tubes opened. 4 Mark 14s were launched in a precise spread. Seconds later, the water erupted ahead of Shokaku's bow. The first torpedo struck her starboard side, ripping through the hull below the waterline. Steel groaned. Flooding began. The carrier, pride of the Imperial Navy, had been hit by an unseen predator beneath the waves. A second torpedo found its mark, tearing through machinery compartments. Shokaku's crew scrambled to contain fires, sealed bulkheads, and maintain stability. Panic and precision battled across a deck simultaneously. Explosions echoed through the ship. Smoke and steam boiled from damaged compartments. Aircraft on deck were damaged or destroyed. The crew fought with determination, but the damage was critical. Kossler held steady, observing from periscope. Mark. Repeat pattern. 1 more for safety. The third torpedo struck, ripping through the flight deck hangar area. Shokaku listed heavily, water flooding her compartments for the first time. The soaring crane realized the threat lurking beneath the ocean. A silent hunter, patient and deadly. That Shokaku's crew worked tirelessly to stabilize her. Damage control parties filled bulkheads, pumped water, and fought fires. Despite severe flooding and multiple torpedo hits, she remained afloat, testament to Japanese engineering and crew discipline. Cavalla's attack was over, but the hunters of the deep had proven a terrifying truth. Even Japan's pride was not invulnerable. The ocean had claimed nothing that day, yet the message was clear. The era of unchallenged dominance was ending. Shokaku survived, but she was now marked, a target in the relentless expansion of the American submarine fleet. The attack sent shockwaves through the Japanese Navy. Commanders reviewed escort tactics, damage reports, and the vulnerabilities of even their most prized carriers. Shokaku returned to dry dock for repairs, her decks scarred, her hangars reconstructed, her crew hardened by the close brush with death. Meanwhile, USS Cavalla and other submarines honed their skills, learning from each engagement. America's silent service was becoming a weapon capable of striking fear across the Pacific, 1 torpedo at a time. The encounter between Shokaku and Cavalla demonstrated the deadly calculus of modern naval warfare. Power above water could be neutralized beneath it. Speed and size could not guarantee survival. Patience, stealth, and precise execution could turn the tide of battle. This was the new face of the Pacific War, invisible, relentless, and merciless. For Shokaku, the hunt was not over. For Cavalla, the moment of triumph was only the beginning. And the Pacific, vast and indifferent, waited silently for the next engagement. WWII mid-1944. The Pacific War had reached a turning point. Shokaku, scarred from previous battles, had returned to service, rebuilt, reinforced, and ready for action. Her decks gleamed under the tropical sun, her air groups fully trained, her crew hardened by experience. But beneath the waves, the Americans had been waiting. Their submarines, once plagued by failures, had become hunters of unparalleled skill. Among them prowled USS Cavalla, a Gato-class submarine under the command of Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler. The stage was set, the hunter and the hunted, 2 forces destined to collide in the silent depths of the Pacific. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal had worked tirelessly to repair Shokaku after damage sustained in earlier battles. Hull plates were replaced, engines overhauled, hangars reinforced, anti-aircraft guns upgraded. She emerged stronger, faster, deadlier, a reborn symbol of Japanese naval pride. Her crew, aware of the lurking threat posed by American submarines, remained vigilant. Drills became more rigorous. Torpedo watches doubled. Every day at sea was a rehearsal for the unknown. The soaring crane had survived previous battles. But the ocean never forgives hubris. USS Cavalla departed Pearl Harbor in early 1944, patrolling the Mariana and Philippine waters. Kossler studied intelligence reports, Japanese convoy movements, and aerial reconnaissance. He tracked Shokaku's fleet like a shadow, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Patience, he told his crew. We strike when the target makes herself vulnerable. No mistakes. Submariners spent long hours submerged, scanning with sonar, calculating positions, and coordinating torpedo spreads. The tension aboard was palpable. A single miscalculation could cost the boat, the crew, and the mission 4 days. Cavalla trailed Shokaku's fleet. The carrier's escorts, cruisers and destroyers, patrolled aggressively, but Kossler's skill kept the submarine hidden. Sonar pings marked enemy movements. Destroyers closing in. Aircraft overhead. Convoy ships shifting course. Kossler adjusted constantly, calculating angles and timing, ensuring that when the strike came, it would be lethal 4 days. Cavalla trailed Shokaku's fleet. The carrier's escorts, cruisers and destroyers, patrolled aggressively, but Kossler's skill kept the submarine hidden. Sonar pings marked enemy movements. Destroyers closing in. Aircraft overhead. Convoy ships shifting course. Kossler adjusted constantly, calculating angles and timing, ensuring that when the strike came, it would be lethal 4 days. Cavalla trailed Shokaku's fleet. The carrier's escorts, cruisers and destroyers, patrolled aggressively, but Kossler's skill kept the submarine hidden. Sonar pings marked enemy movements. Destroyers closing in. Aircraft overhead. Convoy ships shifting course. Kossler adjusted constantly, calculating angles and timing, ensuring that when the strike came, it would be lethal 4 days. Cavalla trailed Shokaku's fleet. The carrier's escorts, cruisers and destroyers, patrolled aggressively, but Kossler's skill kept the submarine hidden. Sonar pings marked enemy movements. Destroyers closing in. Aircraft overhead. Convoy ships shifting course. Kossler adjusted constantly, calculating angles and timing, ensuring that when the strike came, it would be lethal 4 days. Cavalla trailed Shokaku's fleet. The carrier's escorts, cruisers and destroyers, patrolled aggressively, but Kossler's skill kept the submarine hidden. Sonar pings marked enemy movements. Destroyers closing in. Aircraft overhead. Convoy ships shifting course. Kossler adjusted constantly, calculating angles and timing, ensuring that when the strike came, it would be lethal 4 days. Cavalla trailed Shokaku's fleet. The carrier's escorts, cruisers and destroyers, patrolled aggressively, but Kossler's skill kept the submarine hidden. Sonar pings marked enemy movements. Destroyers closing in. Aircraft overhead. Convoy ships shifting course. Kossler adjusted constantly, calculating angles and timing, ensuring that when the strike came, it would be lethal. The hunt was a chess game of steel, water, and nerves. Shokaku moved above like a soaring predator. Cavalla waited beneath, silent and patient, ready to turn the hunter into the hunted. June 30th, 1944. Shokaku and her escort fleet steamed through the South China Sea, returning from operations near the Marianas. Cavalla, submerged at periscope depth, maneuvered into attack position. Kossler's calculations were precise. Speed, course, and torpedo spread all aligned. Prepare to fire. Steady, mark. The crew waited, every eye on the periscope, every hand ready at the torpedo controls. At 8:09 hours, Cavalla launched her spread of torpedoes. The first torpedo struck Shokaku amidships. Steel groaned as the impact ripped through compartments below the waterline. Flooding began immediately. A second torpedo hit the engine room, knocking out propulsion and electrical systems. Smoke and steam rose from damaged sections. Crew scrambled to contain fires. Third torpedo, fire now. Kossler ordered. The third torpedo slammed into the hangar deck, tearing through aircraft, fuel stores, and munitions. Shokaku began to list heavily, her pride and power crumbling under the unseen assault. Shokaku's crew fought valiantly. Damage control parties sealed bulkheads, pumped water, and fought fires. Pilots rushed to move aircraft away from burning sections. Sailors risked their lives to maintain stability even as the carrier heaved under repeated torpedo strikes. Discipline and training kept her afloat for precious minutes longer. Her crew had survived attacks before, But this time, the ocean had chosen its moment. WWII 1100 hours, Shokaku was fatally compromised. Flooding could no longer be contained. Fires raged uncontrollably, and the list became irreversible. The proud soaring crane, carrier of legends, defender of the rising sun, began her final descent. With a final, silent groan of steel, Shokaku slipped beneath the waves. Her name would live on in memory, but her decks, aircraft, and crews were gone, swallowed by the Pacific, leaving only echoes of battle and courage behind. At USS Cavalla surfaced hours later, the crew exhausted but triumphant. Reports were filed. Sonar logs reviewed. The reality of the kill settled over the boat like a solemn weight. For the Americans, it was victory, a testament to skill, patience, and perseverance. For the Japanese, it was loss, a symbol that even the mightiest carriers were vulnerable to the silent hunters beneath the waves. The Pacific War raged on, but one truth was clear: the balance of power was shifting, and the deep ocean was no longer a sanctuary for any ship. Shokaku's sinking marked a turning point in naval warfare. It demonstrated the effectiveness of submarines against capital ships, the importance of stealth, and the unforgiving nature of the sea. Her story lives on, in the hearts of survivors, in naval history, and in the lessons learned from steel, fire, and water. The soaring crane had soared too high, and in her fall, she reshaped the Pacific forever. While carriers clashed above the waves, a silent war raged beneath them. The Pacific Ocean, vast and indifferent, was the hunting ground of the silent service, the United States submarines. Once considered auxiliary vessels, these submarines had become the vanguard of American naval strategy. Early failures, flawed torpedoes, and inexperienced crews had taught harsh lessons, but by 1944, the silent service had become a weapon of unprecedented precision. The first 2 years of the Pacific War were brutal for American submariners. Mark 14 torpedoes failed. Mechanical malfunctions sank opportunities instead of targets. Crew inexperience led to misjudged attacks and narrow escapes. Yet every failure was a lesson. Commanders studied enemy patterns, mapped supply routes, and refined tactics. Every patrol strengthened resolve. Every narrow escape sharpened skills. The ocean had been cruel, but it had also forged a new kind of hunter. Patient, silent, and relentless submarines learned to attack not with brute force, but with cunning. Night surface attacks allowed maximum speed while minimizing detection. Coordinated wolfpack tactics enabled multiple submarines to strike convoys simultaneously. Periscopes became eyes of precision, guiding torpedoes with deadly accuracy. Officers drilled crews relentlessly, emphasizing coordination, stealth, and timing. Every crew member understood that a single error could mean death, but a single success could turn the tide of war. The Gato-class submarines, including USS Cavalla, became the embodiment of these lessons. More durable hulls allowed deeper dives. Enhanced sonar and radar detection improved navigation and target acquisition. Torpedoes, once unreliable, were refined to strike true. Technology alone was not enough. It was the combination of steel, skill, and patience that made the silent service formidable. Among the silent hunters were men whose names would become legend. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, USS Cavalla, meticulous, patient, and decisive. Richard A. Chicane, USS Tang, daring and innovative torpedo commander. Dudley W. Morton, USS Wahoo, aggressive tactician whose raids became legendary. Their stories were not of glory above the waves, but of endurance beneath them. Confined in steel tubes, submerged for days, living on minimal food, and constantly under the threat of depth charges. WWII 1944, Japanese shipping lanes were heavily trafficked. Submarines tracked convoys across thousands of miles, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Each patrol was a high-stakes game of stealth, calculation, and nerves. A single torpedo could destroy a carrier, a transport, or an entire convoy. And yet, the ocean was as much an enemy as the ships it concealed. Submarines navigated storms, thermoclines, and strong currents, all while maintaining radio silence and avoiding detection. Life beneath the waves was claustrophobic, tense, and psychologically exhausting. Submariners endured heat, humidity, diesel fumes, and the constant threat of attack. Every creak of the hull, every sonar ping, every distant explosion was a reminder of their fragility. Yet these men adapted. They developed an almost instinctive connection with their vessels, Anticipating enemy movements and surviving encounters that would break ordinary sailors, the silent service became a force not measured in numbers, but in patience, precision, and the ability to wait, unseen, unheard, and deadly. By the summer of 1944, the silent service had begun to reshape the Pacific. Supply lines were disrupted. Japanese convoys were decimated. Even mighty carriers, once thought untouchable, were now vulnerable. Every success reinforced the lesson: the ocean belonged to those who could move unseen, strike precisely, and disappear before retaliation. Shokaku, though powerful, was not immune. The lessons of Cavalla, Tang, and other submarines were clear. No ship, no matter how proud or fast, could outrun the hunters beneath the waves. The silent service had turned the Pacific into a chessboard of invisible threats. Every patrol, every strike, every narrow escape was part of a larger war, a war fought in shadows and silence. The stage was now set for the final series of confrontations that would determine the fate of carriers like Shokaku and the ultimate supremacy of the Pacific. By mid-1944, the Pacific had become a battleground of attrition, innovation, and relentless pursuit. The Imperial Japanese Navy, still proud from victories past, was now stretched across thousands of miles, their fleet tasked with defending the Marianas, their empire's final barrier against the advancing Allies. At the heart of this effort was Shokaku, carrier of legend, rebuilt and reinforced, her decks polished and her crew seasoned by fire. She was more than a ship. She was a symbol of Japan's hope, courage, and desperate resistance. But the Americans were not idle. Beneath the waves, the silent service had learned, adapted, and evolved. Their submarines now prowled the ocean with lethal purpose, ready to strike at the heart of Japan's carrier force. The Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, represented Japan's last defensive bulwark in the Central Pacific. For the Imperial Navy, holding them meant buying time. For the Americans, capturing them meant opening the path to Japan itself. Shokaku steamed as part of the carrier task force, escorting troop transports, providing air cover, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the U.S. fleet. Her air groups were ready, trained for rapid strikes and coordinated attacks. Every sortie was a test of skill, endurance, and survival. Every movement across the vast ocean could be observed, anticipated, and exploited by the growing network of American submarines. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, aboard USS Cavalla, had tracked Japanese movements for weeks. The intelligence was clear, the Marianas were critical, and Shokaku's presence was an opportunity. "This is it," Kossler said to his crew. "Patience, timing, and precision, that's all we need." Cavalla's patrols became a meticulous game of observation, calculating enemy course, speed, and fleet composition. Every sonar ping was analyzed. Every periscope scan was scrutinized. The men of the silent service understood that a single misstep could cost them their lives, but a single perfect strike could change the course of history. June 1944. The Japanese fleet steamed cautiously toward the Marianas. Commanders were aware of the American submarine threat, but underestimated its reach. Destroyer escorts swept the surface, aircraft patrolled overhead, but the silent service moved unseen beneath the waves. Shokaku and her air groups prepared for operations, unaware that a shadow followed them. Relentless, patient, deadly, the Pacific was no longer just a stage for carrier battles. It was a chessboard of silent hunters and vigilant prey, each move carrying the weight of life and death. Both sides anticipated the coming clash, what would later be called the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese carriers trained for massive air sorties, planning for long-range strikes against the approaching U.S. fleet. American submarines positioned themselves along likely routes, ready to intercept, stalk, and strike. Cavalla and her sister submarines were ordered to intercept the Japanese task forces, with a single objective: sink the carriers before they could launch their planes. Every captain, every crew member, knew that success would depend on patience, stealth, and precision. Every patrol was a silent countdown to the inevitable collision of hunter and hunted. As the fleets moved closer, the tension became almost tangible. Shokaku, proud and confident, steamed steadily toward her mission. Cavalla, patient and calculated, followed beneath the waves. "Wait for the right moment," Kossler ordered. "We strike only when we are certain." The Americans had learned from past encounters: attacks must be perfectly timed, torpedoes perfectly calibrated, and escape routes meticulously planned. The ocean had become both a battlefield and a partner, a silent accomplice in the hunter's strategy. For days, American submarines shadowed Shokaku's task force. Cavalla adjusted depth and speed to remain undetected. Sonar operators tracked Japanese destroyers and cruisers. Crew members worked in silence, hearts beating with tension, eyes fixed on the periscope. Every Japanese maneuver was calculated. Every escort formation was studied. The silent service had become an invisible hand guiding the fate of the Pacific. Shokaku moved like a predator above, confident in her power and speed. Yet beneath her, patience and stealth was shaping a fate she could not see. As the fleets approached the Philippine Sea, both sides prepared for the largest naval engagement yet. Shokaku's crew conducted drills, armed aircraft, and readied anti-submarine measures. Cavalla and other submarines slipped through patrol lines, preparing for the final series of attacks that would decide the fate of the carriers. The Pacific had taught one lesson repeatedly. No ship, no matter how mighty, could escape the ocean's hidden hunters forever. The stage was set, the hunters were ready, and the road to the Philippine Sea was paved with tension, anticipation, and the silent promise of destiny. The Philippine Sea, June 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier fleet, including the famed Shokaku, steamed with purpose, preparing to launch air attacks that would protect their holdings in the Marianas. Beneath them, the ocean itself seemed to watch. USS Cavalla, Gato-class submarine, prowled silently. Every crew member understood their objective: patience, precision, and patience again. This was the calm before the storm, the final approach toward history. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler studied charts, sonar readings, and Japanese fleet movements. Shokaku and her escorts moved along a predictable route, but danger lurked everywhere. "We have to get in close," Kossler said. "Speed, course, and timing must be perfect. One mistake and we're done." The crew recalculated torpedo spreads, adjusted depth settings, and rehearsed attack sequences. Every sonar ping, every creak, every wave was monitored. The ocean was no longer a passive stage. It was an active participant, concealing dangers, creating opportunities, and shaping destiny. Shokaku's escorts, cruisers and destroyers, patrolled aggressively. Sonar sweeps, depth charges, and patrol aircraft created a deadly web. Below deck, Cavalla's crew remained calm. "Keep her steady at 6 knots. Maintain depth. Do not react unless absolutely necessary." The Americans had learned to respect the enemy's vigilance. Every misstep could be fatal. Every second mattered. Shokaku's crew, confident in their speed and escort protection, had no idea a silent predator moved beneath them. Patient, calculating, relentless. Over the next 48 hours, Cavalla shadowed the fleet. Kossler adjusted course constantly, ensuring the submarine remained undetected. Sonar operators mapped escort formations. Torpedo officers prepared launch sequences. Every move was a balance between aggression and caution. The crew had become a single organism, their nerves and instincts intertwined with the submarine itself. Patience had become a weapon. Silence had become a strategy. The moment of attack was near, and the consequences of failure were absolute. From periscope depth, Cavalla's crew observed Shokaku's flight deck. Aircraft lined up for sortie. Deck crews performing drills. Smoke from boilers rising in the tropical heat. "She's moving into position. Prepare torpedoes," Kossler ordered. The tension was palpable. Every man knew the ocean could betray them at any moment. A sudden depth charge, a rogue wave, a miscalculation. Yet they remained focused. The ocean had made killers of men before, and now it polished its apprentices for the decisive strike. The fleet's course allowed Cavalla to move into optimal firing position. Torpedo tubes were loaded. Depth settings confirmed. Spread angles calculated. "Mach, steady, fire on my command," Kossler whispered. For hours, the submarine waited, blending with the ocean, listening to the hum of Japanese engines above, the faint chatter of deck crews, the rhythm of waves. The tension was unbearable. Above, the predator moved with unassuming grace. Below, the hunter prepared to strike. Every calculation, every sonar ping, every heartbeat brought them closer to history. Life aboard Cavalla was claustrophobic and tense. Heat, diesel fumes, and the knowledge of imminent danger weighed heavily on the crew. Yet their discipline never wavered. "Remember, one perfect strike is worth a dozen mistakes," Kossler reminded them. The silent service thrived under this pressure. Their nerves honed by experience, their minds tuned to the rhythms of the ocean and the patterns of enemy ships. The ocean had shaped them into hunters, silent, precise, and patient. And now, all that training, all that vigilance, was about to be tested. As the sun rose over the Philippine Sea, Cavalla slipped into her final approach. Shokaku steamed ahead, unaware that history was closing in from below. The American crew prepared, knowing that minutes could mean the difference between life and death, victory and failure. Every hand, every eye, every mind was focused on the invisible line between hunter and hunted. The ocean waited. The hunter waited, and the pride of the Imperial Navy sailed toward her fate, the Philippine Sea, 1944. The sun rose over the vast expanse of water, but below the surface, darkness and silence ruled. USS Cavalla, having stalked the proud carrier Shokaku for days, was now in position. Every creak of steel, every sonar ping, every whisper from the crew was part of a deadly rhythm. The moment of attack was at hand. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler gave the command. Fire on my mark, steady now. The torpedo tubes opened. For Mark 14 torpedoes streaked silently through the water. Invisible, unstoppable, the first torpedo struck amidships, beneath the waterline. Steel screamed. Bulkheads ruptured. Flooding began immediately. The second torpedo ripped through the engine room. Shokaku's speed faltered. Smoke and steam erupted from damaged sections. Third torpedo, fire. Kossler ordered. The third torpedo slammed into the flight deck, tearing through aircraft, fuel stores, and munitions. Shokaku began to list heavily, the ocean claiming her pride. Alarms blared. Crewmen scrambled, trying to contain fires and flooding. Aircraft toppled from damaged hangars. Explosions rocked the decks. Even trained sailors could not escape the fury of the ocean's silent predator. Every corridor, every compartment became a battlefield. Panic and discipline collided in a desperate fight to keep the carrier afloat. Damage control parties worked feverishly, but the hits were devastating. Shokaku, once a symbol of invincibility, now teetered on the brink of doom. Water poured into compartments, fires raged unchecked, and the carrier's list became irreversible. The pride of the Imperial Navy, the soaring crane, was sinking. Abandon ship if necessary, officers shouted. The ocean had decided. Shokaku, master of the skies and sea, could not survive the precision of the silent service. Beneath the waves, Cavalla remained patient, observing the destruction without a single shot wasted. Every torpedo had found its mark. Every calculation had been perfect amidst the chaos. Japanese sailors struggled for survival. Some risked their lives to rescue comrades from flooded compartments. Pilots leapt from the flight deck into lifeboats. Smoke, fire, and screams filled the air. War was not just steel and strategy. It was fear, courage, and the fragile thread of life that hung over the decks of every ship. Below the surface, Cavalla's crew felt the weight of history. They had achieved a feat that would echo across the Pacific. The sinking of a legendary carrier. WWII late morning, Shokaku's engines failed entirely. Bulkheads collapsed. Fires consumed the deck. With a final groan, the carrier slipped beneath the waves, leaving only a scarred horizon and the silence of the deep. The soaring crane, once proud and untouchable, had been claimed by the ocean. Her name, her aircraft, her crew, memories now entwined with the endless Pacific. Cavalla surfaced hours later, exhausted but victorious. The crew filed reports, recorded logs, and felt the solemn weight of their success. The sinking of Shokaku sent shockwaves through the Japanese Navy. Commanders reviewed vulnerabilities, convoy tactics, and escort strategies. The era of untouchable carriers was over. The silent service had proven its deadly effectiveness. Submarines were no longer auxiliary. They were decisive instruments of war. The ocean, vast and indifferent, had chosen the hunters. Shokaku had fallen, but the war continued, shaped by stealth, patience, and the relentless will of men beneath the waves. The sinking of Shokaku became a case study in submarine warfare, strategy, and the psychology of naval engagements. It demonstrated precision and patience could topple even the mightiest vessels. The ocean could be both shield and weapon. Human courage and skill were as vital as steel and fire. Shokaku's story would live on, not just as a ship lost, but as a lesson in the deadly calculus of the Pacific War. The Pacific was never silent for long. The sinking of Shokaku, pride of the Imperial Navy, sent shockwaves across both sides of the conflict. For the Japanese, The loss was more than material. It was a blow to morale, strategy, and the aura of invincibility that carriers once projected. Imperial Navy commanders convened emergency strategy sessions. Reports flooded in from the survivors of Shokaku, damage assessments, crew casualties, lost aircraft. Escort tactics were revised. Anti-submarine measures intensified. Convoy formations became tighter, more cautious. Yet, no amount of caution could fully eliminate the threat posed by the silent service. Submarines had proven that even the most formidable warships were vulnerable beneath the waves. That Shokaku's loss forced Japan to confront a harsh truth. Their carriers were no longer untouchable symbols of power. Shokaku had played a central role in the Marianas Campaign and the broader Pacific theater. Her sinking disrupted fleet cohesion, limited air support for Japanese operations, and weakened defensive lines in the Central Pacific. Every carrier lost reduced Japan's operational reach, shifted the balance of naval power, and accelerated the momentum of the American advance. The silent service, once underestimated, had now become a decisive weapon in the war's final stages. From the decks of Shokaku, sailors recounted the terror of the torpedo strike. Crewman 1. The ship groaned like it was alive. Water flooded the compartments faster than we could react. Pilot. We jumped from the deck as the hangars burned. I never imagined the ocean could feel so cold and endless. Damage control officer. We tried everything, but the steel itself betrayed us. Their courage, training, and determination delayed the inevitable, but they could not outrun the ocean's judgment. That USS Cavalla's crew reflected on their victory with a mixture of pride and solemnity. Kossler noted the skill and bravery of the Japanese sailors. Crew members recorded meticulous logs of the engagement, knowing they had changed the course of history. For the Americans, it was not just a tactical victory. It was proof that stealth, patience, and precision could triumph over raw power and pride. The sinking of Shokaku reshaped the strategic calculus for both navies. Japan's reliance on carriers was now tempered by vulnerability. The United States recognized the power of submarines as force multipliers. Naval engagements would increasingly combine surface power, air superiority, and undersea stealth. Shokaku's legacy became a lesson for generations of sailors. No ship, no matter how mighty, is invulnerable when the hunter waits patiently beneath the waves. Beyond strategy and steel, the human toll was immense. Hundreds of Japanese sailors lost their lives. Pilots lost their aircraft in dreams of survival. Families and communities in Japan mourned heroes who never returned. Yet amidst the tragedy, stories of heroism emerged. Damage control teams who stayed below decks to save others, pilots guiding men to lifeboats, sailors diving into the ocean to rescue comrades. War is measured in ships and victories, but its true weight is borne by those who live and die in its shadow. The ocean itself had shifted the balance. Submarines continued to disrupt supply lines. Carriers became more vulnerable. Japanese naval operations were increasingly cautious. The silent service had not just sunk a ship, they had changed the rhythm of war in the Pacific. The loss of Shokaku was a symbol of that transformation. The tide was turning. The hunters beneath the waves had proven their lethal mastery, and the Pacific would never again be the same. With the sinking of Shokaku, a new phase of the Pacific War had begun. The silent service had proven its potency, and Japanese supply lines, carriers, and convoys were now under constant threat. USS Cavalla was not an exception. She was a herald of a growing force, a network of submarines whose reach extended across thousands of miles of ocean. Patrols intensified, attacks became more daring, and every Japanese ship moving in the Pacific faced the possibility of unseen death beneath the waves. By late 1944, the U.S. Navy had increased the number of submarines in the Pacific. Wolfpack tactics were developed, allowing multiple submarines to coordinate attacks on convoys. Improved intelligence from codebreakers allowed submarines to anticipate routes and timings. Crews were trained for extended patrols, often lasting over 60 days. In isolated and perilous conditions, the ocean had become a vast battlefield of shadows. Every convoy, every transport, every fuel ship was a potential target, and nowhere was safe. The consequences for Japan were devastating. Merchant shipping, crucial for transporting food, fuel, and troops, was decimated. Cargo ships were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Troop movement slowed, impacting defensive operations across the Pacific. Morale plummeted as news of submarine attacks spread through the ranks. The silent service had become a force multiplier. Even the mightiest warships were vulnerable. But the lifelines of an empire were even more exposed. Individual patrols highlighted both courage and innovation. USS Tang and Lieutenant Commander Richard H. Kane perfected night surface attacks that struck deep into enemy convoys. USS Wahoo, commanded by Dudley W. Morton, became legendary for aggressive tactics, evading destroyers while sinking vital supply ships. Submariners endured heat, claustrophobia, and the constant threat of depth charges, yet they emerged victorious time and again. Men and machines worked in harmony beneath the waves, turning fear into precision, tension into deadly effectiveness. The Japanese Navy became acutely aware of the submarine threat. Escorts were forced to operate constantly at high alert. Convoys were rerouted, slowing the transport of vital supplies. Air patrols over the ocean increased, yet many attacks went undetected until the submarine had already struck. The silent service was more than a tactical threat. It was a psychological weapon, instilling fear, uncertainty, and hesitation, traits that eroded Japan's strategic effectiveness over time. Advances in technology amplified submarine effectiveness. Improved torpedoes reduced failures from previous years. Radar allowed night attacks with unprecedented precision. Sonar improvements increased detection and evasion capabilities. Submarines had become instruments of both terror and inevitability. Where once carriers and battleships ruled the waves, now the ocean belonged to those who could strike unseen. By the end of 1944, the combined effect of submarine operations had reshaped the Pacific War. Japanese supply lines were crippled, limiting operational reach. Carrier task forces became more cautious, reducing the frequency and effectiveness of air sorties. U.S. surface and air forces gained a strategic advantage as the silent service weakened Japanese mobility and morale. The war was no longer only fought above the waves. Beneath them, the hunters advanced, shaping every battle, every strategy, every outcome with silent precision. The silent service had demonstrated a fundamental truth. Dominance over the ocean is not measured by size or firepower alone. Patience, stealth, precision, and courage could tip the scales against even the most formidable opponents. Shokaku's sinking was only the beginning. The lessons learned, the courage displayed, and the dominance established by submarines would echo through the remaining months of the war, sealing the fate of an empire and heralding the rise of a new form of naval warfare. By late 1944, the Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard for the remnants of Japan's once mighty fleet. The silent service had seized control beneath the waves, striking at supply ships, troop transports, and even capital ships whenever opportunity arose. USS Cavalla and her sister submarines were now part of a coordinated effort to tighten the noose around the Japanese Empire, cutting off resources, morale, and the ability to wage war effectively. Submarines operated with unprecedented frequency. Patrols lasted weeks, sometimes months, in isolation. Wolfpack tactics allowed coordinated strikes on heavily escorted convoys. Torpedo attacks were now combined with aerial reconnaissance and intelligence from Allied codebreakers. The hunters had become more than weapons. They were the keystone of America's strategy in the Pacific. Each submarine stalked the sea like a shadow, invisible, patient, and lethal, shaping the movements and choices of the enemy fleet above. With most major carriers destroyed or damaged, Japanese naval planners relied on remaining ships to defend supply routes. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were stripped for defensive operations. Troop and fuel convoys became primary targets. Aircraft carriers, once the pride of Japan, were increasingly scarce and vulnerable. Every strike against these remnants further weakened Japan's ability to resist. Each sinking tightened the grip of the silent service and underscored the futility of facing the ocean unguarded. Submarine commanders embraced daring tactics. Night surface attacks under minimal lighting. Close-range torpedo spreads within heavily patrolled areas. Coordinated ambushes along choke points in the Philippine Sea and South China Sea. Risk was calculated, precision was absolute, and patience remained paramount. The ocean demanded respect, and those who mastered it could dictate the fate of entire fleets. Cavalla's crew, along with others, exemplified extraordinary courage. Officers and sonar operators endured sleep deprivation, extreme heat, and constant threat of depth charges. Torpedo crews work under immense pressure, knowing each shot could decide life or death. Sailors rescued shipmates from flooding compartments and fire outbreaks, demonstrating heroism under unimaginable stress. These men were more than hunters. They were survivors, strategists, and silent architects of a new naval reality. The Japanese Navy faced not only material losses but also a growing sense of vulnerability. Convoys moved cautiously, often delayed or rerouted. Escorts became increasingly protective, sometimes ineffective against submarine tactics. Fear and uncertainty undermined morale among crews, commanders, and the homeland. The silent service wielded not only torpedoes but psychological dominance. Even the most seasoned sailors could not escape the tension of an unseen enemy beneath the waves. WWII 1945. The dominance of U.S. submarines had decisively shifted the balance. Japanese shipping losses reached catastrophic levels. Supply chains were crippled, limiting fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Remaining fleets operated cautiously, reducing the effectiveness of carrier-based operations. The Pacific, once a vast expanse of freedom for the Imperial Navy, had become a hunting ground for those who moved unseen, striking decisively and disappearing without trace. Submarines like Cavalla had done more than sink ships. They had set the stage for the final Allied advance toward Japan. Supply and troop shortages would weaken resistance on every island. Remaining Japanese warships were too few and too dispersed to challenge U.S. dominance effectively. Submarine patrols ensured the Allies controlled the seas from the Marianas to the home islands. The silent service had reshaped the Pacific War. Steel, patience, and courage beneath the waves dictated the course of battles above them. And now, the stage was set for the ultimate confrontations in the final months of the conflict. WWII 1945. The Japanese Navy was a shadow of its former self. Carriers were scarce, supply lines were crippled, and the remnants of the fleet moved cautiously, aware that the ocean itself had become a lethal adversary. Beneath the waves, the silent service prowled with unrelenting purpose. Each submarine patrol was a calculated strike, a puzzle of stealth, patience, and precision. The final pursuit had begun, closing in on Japan's home waters, tightening the noose of strategy and inevitability. With Shokaku gone, only a handful of carriers remained operational. Shokaku, veteran of countless battles, now isolated and cautious. Escort carriers protecting remaining troop transports. Limited aircraft for defensive operations. These carriers, once symbols of Japanese naval might, were now prizes for the hunters beneath the waves. Submarines tracked their movements tirelessly, exploiting weaknesses and waiting for the perfect strike. American submarines operated closer to Japanese home waters than ever before. Patrols extended into the East China Sea, the Sea of Japan, and around Okinawa. Coordinated attacks disrupted fuel, ammunition, and troop reinforcements. Torpedo tactics evolved to strike from unexpected angles, often under heavy escort. The silent service had transformed from a supporting arm into a decisive instrument of war. Their reach and precision dictated not only battles but the movements and morale of the Imperial Navy. Japanese commanders, desperate to protect what remained, employed increasingly risky tactics. Convoys moved under cover of darkness and air patrols. Submarines and destroyer screens attempted to shield capital ships. Reinforcements were prioritized for the home islands at great cost, yet desperation could not overcome mastery. The hunters beneath the waves had learned patience, stealth, and the deadly calculus of war. Every misstep by the Japanese fleet was an opportunity for attack, every error magnified by the ocean's silence. USS Cavalla, USS Tang, and other submarines carried out daring patrols. Night surface attacks destroyed transports before escorts could react. Close-range torpedo spreads eliminated warships previously considered untouchable. Long-range stalking allowed submarines to intercept reinforcements months in advance. Each engagement was a dance with death. Skill, nerve, and timing were the only shields against catastrophe. Yet the silent service thrived, forging history in the depths of the Pacific. The Imperial Navy faced cumulative fear and uncertainty. Convoys were rerouted, delayed, or abandoned. Escorts overextended themselves, leaving gaps. Commanders feared unseen torpedoes, disrupting cohesion and offensive operations. The silent service had done more than sink ships. It had undermined confidence, reshaped strategy, and brought Japan to the defensive in its own waters. Every patrol, every sinking, every successful evasion reinforced the inevitability of American dominance. By mid-1945. Supply shortages crippled Japanese island garrisons. Remaining carriers were scarce, aircraft numbers dwindling. Allied forces gained unchallenged freedom to maneuver in the Pacific. The ocean had been mastered by the Americans, a combination of steel, courage, and patience beneath the waves. The final pursuit was not only a campaign of destruction, but a psychological siege that paved the way for victory. Submarines now focused on the last remnants of Japan's defensive perimeter, targeting troop reinforcements bound for Okinawa, intercepting fuel and ammunition convoys, shadowing the few remaining carriers and battleships. The silent service had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. From Shokaku to the final transports, the hunters beneath the waves dictated the fate of an empire. The stage was now set for the ultimate chapter of the Pacific War, the final months of conflict, the last battles, and the ocean's ultimate reckoning. Spring 1945. Japan's naval power was a shadow of its former self. The once proud fleet that had dominated the Pacific now moved cautiously, aware that beneath every wave lurked unseen hunters. The silent service had become the executioner of strategy, the relentless hand that choked the lifelines of an empire. Submarines prowled from the Philippines to the home islands, striking with surgical precision, leaving fear, destruction, and chaos in their wake. By this point, U.S. submarines were operating in coordinated, near-constant patrols. Multiple wolf packs intercepted Japanese convoys simultaneously. Submarine-on-submarine tactics were occasionally employed to counter remaining Japanese submersibles. Safest night attacks became increasingly daring. Taking advantage of radar and stealth, the ocean itself became a weapon, a battlefield where surface ships moved at the mercy of shadows beneath the waves. Every patrol was a test of nerve, every torpedo a potential death sentence for those above. Japan's remaining ships were concentrated and vulnerable. Troop transports bound for Okinawa were prime targets. Oil and ammunition convoys became critical points of vulnerability. Remaining carriers and battleships were heavily shadowed by U.S. submarines. Each strike weakened the Imperial Navy's ability to defend, attack, or even retreat. The hunters had become arbiters of fate, deciding where and when the enemy could move, and whether they would survive. Submarine commanders pushed limits, coordinating simultaneous attacks on heavily escorted convoys, using deceptive maneuvers to evade depth charges, executing torpedo spreads at close range to maximize damage. The line between bravery and recklessness was razor-thin. Yet for the silent service, these risks were necessary to impose control over the ocean and hasten the end of the war. The cumulative effect on Japan was catastrophic. Convoys slowed or diverted, starving frontline troops. Escorts overextended, creating gaps for submarine attacks. Morale collapsed as the perception of invincibility vanished. The silent service was more than a fleet of submarines. It was a psychological hammer, striking at the confidence and cohesion of the enemy. Even the bravest sailors faced the ever-present fear of an unseen predator beneath the waves. Accounts from submarine crews highlight both danger and ingenuity. Torpedo officers executed perfectly timed attacks under heavy escort fire. Sonar operators detected subtle movements, anticipating evasive maneuvers. Crews endured exhaustion, heat, and constant threat, yet emerged victorious. These men had become architects of the Pacific's final fate. Every patrol, every strike, and every evasion contributed to the ultimate collapse of Japanese resistance. By mid-1945, Japanese shipping losses were catastrophic, limiting fuel, ammunition, and troop movements. Remaining carriers and battleships were too few to mount effective defense. The Allies controlled the seas, with submarine operations dictating strategy and outcomes. From Shokaku to the lost convoy, the ocean had been mastered by those beneath it. Submarines had not only sunk ships, they had sealed the fate of an empire. Submarines' final patrols laid the groundwork for the capture of Okinawa and other strategic islands. Air raids on Japan's home islands with minimal naval resistance. The isolation and starvation of remaining Japanese garrisons. The silent service had transformed naval warfare. Through stealth, patience, and precision, they had shaped every battle, disrupted every supply chain, and defined the final months of the Pacific War. The war in the Pacific was over. The Japanese Empire had fallen, and the ocean, once a theater of relentless battle, returned to silence. Yet beneath the waves, the lessons of conflict lingered. The silent service, whose torpedoes had felled carriers like Shokaku, had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. The men of the silent service returned home as unsung heroes. Many had endured months in claustrophobic submarines, under constant threat of death. Their victories, though decisive, were often overshadowed by the larger carrier and air battles. Reports highlighted their contributions. Over 1,300 Japanese ships sunk, including carriers, battleships, and critical supply vessels. The ocean had tested them, the enemy had challenged them, and they had emerged as masters of stealth, precision, and patience. Submarine warfare had evolved rapidly during the Pacific War. Torpedo technology was refined for reliability and effectiveness. Wolfpack tactics became a cornerstone of coordinated attacks. Sonar and radar integration enhanced both detection and evasion. These innovations not only won battles, they transformed naval doctrine for generations to come. Submarines were no longer auxiliary. They were decisive instruments of strategy and leverage. Accounts from submarine crews illustrate both courage and sacrifice. Officers and enlisted men endured extreme heat, deprivation, and mental strain. Many faced moral dilemmas, whether to pursue enemy warships or spare civilians aboard transports. Some formed lifelong bonds forged in the silence and pressure of the ocean's depths. Courage is often quiet. Bravery is measured not in applause, but in the silent decisions made beneath the waves. In darkness, under the weight of life and death, the war taught profound lessons. Patience and strategy often outweighed brute force. Stealth and precision could redefine naval superiority. Every vessel, no matter how powerful, was vulnerable to the unseen. The Shokaku's sinking was not merely an isolated victory. It was a symbol of how intelligence, courage, and timing could shape the fate of empires. The achievements of submarines in the Pacific War influenced future conflicts. Submarine doctrine became a central pillar of naval strategy worldwide. Engineers and tacticians studied Pacific War patrols to improve ship design and tactics. Veterans passed down knowledge, ensuring the silent service's legacy endured. The ocean had always been vast, mysterious, and deadly. Through courage and innovation, a small force beneath the waves had imposed control over it, forever changing the course of naval history. Shokaku lies at the bottom of the Pacific, a testament to both Japanese pride and the lethality of unseen hunters. USS Cavalla and the silent service demonstrated that war is not won only by the largest guns or the fastest ships, but by strategy, patience, and mastery of the unseen. The echoes of the deep remind us, beneath the waves, history was written in silence, courage, and precision. The war was over, but the stories remained. The silent service, whose actions had reshaped the Pacific, was now remembered not just in naval reports, but in the hearts and minds of those who served, and the generations that followed. Men who had lived in the depths of steel and silence carried memories no one else could understand. Every patrol, every attack, every narrow escape was etched in their minds forever. Crewman 1. We were just doing our job, but down there, you feel the weight of the ocean, and the weight of responsibility. One mistake could cost hundreds of lives. Crewman 2. The first time we fired torpedoes at a carrier, it was surreal. You can see the ship, hear the alarms above, and yet, you're invisible. It's both terrifying and exhilarating. These men lived in a paradox, invisible predators, yet profoundly human. Their courage was measured not in medals alone, but in the quiet decisions that saved their comrades and completed their missions. After the war, USS Cavalla and other submarines were awarded battle stars and commendations. Officers like Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler received honors for leadership in valor. The silent service earned a reputation as a decisive force. Despite often being overshadowed by larger battleships and carriers, recognition came slowly. But the impact of their service resonated across the Navy, and the broader history of naval warfare. Museums, memorials, and naval histories commemorate submarine achievements. Veterans shared experiences in oral histories, books, and documentaries. The sinking of ships like Shokaku became case studies in strategy and courage. Submarine warfare shaped not only military tactics, but also cultural memory. The silent service became a symbol of ingenuity, bravery, and the invisible hand that changed the course of history. Crewman 3. You come back, and life seems normal, but down there, you saw things that stay with you forever. Ships sinking, men struggling, it leaves a mark. War leaves no soul untouched. Even in victory, the men of the silent service carried memories of loss, sacrifice, and the ocean's indifference. Yet in their quiet heroism, they embodied the essence of courage, unseen, patient, and relentless. The lessons of the silent service extended beyond warfare. Discipline under pressure, teamwork in extreme conditions, strategic thinking and patience, respect for the ocean's power. These lessons became guiding principles for generations of sailors and military strategists. The story of Shokaku's sinking was more than history. It was a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and bravery the ocean remembers. The steel hulls, the echoing sonar pings, the torpedoes fired in silence, they are all part of a story that endures. The silent service demonstrated that true power is not always seen, and true courage often goes unnoticed. Through patience, skill, and sacrifice, they shaped history, leaving a legacy that echoes across the deep and across time. The sinking of Shokaku and the relentless patrols of the silent service left more than a mark on the Pacific. They left a blueprint for naval strategy in the modern age. By demonstrating the effectiveness of stealth, patience, and precision, submarines had rewritten the rules of maritime warfare. Commanders worldwide took note. The ocean could no longer be dominated solely by firepower and numbers. The Pacific War showcased submarines as decisive weapons, capable of cutting supply lines and crippling logistics, able to threaten even the most formidable surface fleets. Useful not only for attack but also intelligence gathering and reconnaissance, submarines were no longer secondary players. They were strategic instruments, able to change the course of a war without being seen. Every torpedo fired, every convoy intercepted, every silent stalk beneath the waves underscored their strategic value. World War II innovations informed post-war naval development. Improved sonar, radar, and torpedo guidance systems. Wolfpack tactics evolved into coordinated multi-submarine operations. Submarine design emphasized endurance, stealth, and versatility. From steel-hulled World War II vessels to nuclear-powered submarines, lessons learned beneath the Pacific waves guided decades of technological advancement. The precision that sent Shokaku to the bottom became a foundation for modern undersea warfare. Commanders recognized key tactical principles. Patience and timing could overcome superior numbers. Intelligence and code-breaking were as crucial as torpedoes. The psychological element of unseen threats could shape enemy strategy. The silent service had shown that control over the unseen could dictate the course of surface battles, air campaigns, and entire theaters of war. Every engagement became a study in anticipation, strategy, and calculated risk. The legacy of World War II submarine operations carried forward into the Cold War and beyond. Nuclear deterrence relied on submarine stealth and mobility. Anti-submarine warfare became a central naval concern. Naval training programs incorporated lessons from Pacific patrols, emphasizing patience, coordination, and operational endurance. From the Pacific to the Atlantic, the principles of submarine dominance shaped strategic thinking and fleet composition for generations. The ocean had taught one enduring lesson. Dominance beneath the waves could decide the fate of nations. Beyond technology and strategy, World War II submarines offered timeless lessons in human resilience. Leadership under pressure, teamwork in confined, high-stakes environments, decision-making when lives and strategy hung in the balance. The silent service demonstrated that success is never accidental. It is earned through discipline, courage, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. Lessons as vital today as they were beneath the Pacific waves in 1944. The story of Shokaku and the silent service resonates beyond history books. It is a story of strategy, innovation, courage, and the unseen hand that can change the tide of war. Modern navies continue to study, learn, and honor these lessons. Beneath the ocean, the echoes of the silent service remain, a testament to ingenuity, precision, and the enduring power of the human spirit in conflict. War is measured in ships sunk, battles won, and strategies executed. Yet its true cost is measured in lives lost, courage displayed, and sacrifices made in silence. The silent service, whose torpedoes sent Shokaku and countless other ships to the ocean floor, bore this cost quietly and heroically. Stories from submarine patrols reveal extraordinary bravery. Damage control officers fought fires and flooding while the hull groaned around them. Torpedo crews executed precise attacks under the constant threat of counterfire. Lookouts and sonar operators detected subtle enemy movements that saved lives and ships. Every crew member, from the youngest seaman to the commanding officer, contributed to a complex ballet of courage, precision, and resilience. The difference between life and death often rested on a single decision, a single action performed in the depths of the ocean. The war claimed hundreds of submarine crew members. Patrols in the Pacific were long, claustrophobic, and perilous. Depth charge attacks could destroy entire vessels within minutes. Many submariners never returned home, their bravery lost beneath the waves. For every victory, there was cost. For every enemy ship sunk, a story of perseverance, fear, and sacrifice unfolded in the steel corridors of submarines prowling the Pacific. Survivors recount bonds formed in extreme conditions, sharing cramped quarters for weeks, often without sunlight, relying on one another's skills for survival, supporting each other through loss, fear, and exhaustion. In the silence of the deep, crew members became family. Their trust, courage, and camaraderie ensured that the mission succeeded and lives were saved. Crewman 1. When the alarms went off, we didn't panic. We had trained for this every day, but it didn't make it any less terrifying. Crewman 2. I lost friends in that patrol. Men who jumped into the ocean to save others. We never forgot them. These memories endure, proof that the valor of the silent service was not only in sinking ships, but in protecting, supporting, and honoring one another after the war. Submarine memorials and museums were established. Names of fallen submariners were inscribed on honor rolls. Oral histories preserved their experiences for future generations. The ocean may reclaim their vessels, but it cannot erase their courage. Their sacrifices are remembered, honored, and taught as lessons in bravery, dedication, and selflessness. The story of Shokaku's sinking is not just about strategy or tactics. It is about the men who lived and died beneath the waves, whose valor shaped the course of the Pacific War. Their courage echoes in every sonar ping, every patrol, every story of survival. They are the silent service, heroes in the deepest shadows of the ocean. By mid-1945, Japan's naval power was shattered. Supply lines were severed, carriers destroyed, and the fleet's remaining vessels too few and scattered to mount effective resistance. The silent service, which had begun its campaign with daring patrols like those that sent Shokaku to the bottom, had decisively reshaped the Pacific theater. Every convoy sunk, every transport destroyed, every patrol completed brought the Allies closer to ultimate victory. Submarines continued their relentless campaign, targeting remaining troop transports to cripple defenses on Okinawa and other islands, intercepting fuel shipments critical to the Japanese war effort, tracking and shadowing the few remaining carriers and battleships. The ocean had become an arena of invisible control. Submarines dictated the movement, supply, and morale of the Imperial Navy, leaving Japan unable to sustain a meaningful defense. The consequences were immediate and profound. Troop reinforcements failed to reach key battlefronts. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and limited ship movement. Japanese commanders increasingly avoided risk, ceding initiative to the Allies. From the sinking of Shokaku to the final patrols in Japanese waters, the silent service had weakened Japan's ability to resist long before the first bomb fell on Hiroshima. In August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war, Japan capitulated. U.S. submarines maintained blockades, preventing last-minute supplies or reinforcements. Remaining Japanese naval assets were surrendered or scuttled. The Pacific War officially ended, leaving the ocean a silent witness to the cost of strategy and courage. The silent service had not only sunk ships, they had sealed the fate of an empire. Stealth, patience, and relentless precision had helped bring about the end of one of history's most devastating conflicts. The war concluded, but the lessons endured. Submarines demonstrated that a small, well-trained force could change the outcome of global conflict. Intelligence, stealth, and coordination proved as decisive as firepower. The Pacific Campaign influenced post-war naval strategy, technology, and training. Shokaku's sinking was a single strike in a larger symphony of strategy, courage, and innovation, a symbol of how the silent service shaped the ultimate victory. The Pacific War had cost millions, but individual stories endured. Survivors recounted both horror and heroism aboard submarines. Families of the lost were honored in memorials and ceremonies. Crews reflected on their service as a combination of duty, courage, and camaraderie. Every torpedo fired, every patrol endured, every life risked was part of a greater mission, securing peace and demonstrating that valor beneath the waves could change history. The ocean, once a theater of relentless battle, returned to calm. Yet beneath the waves, the story of the silent service and the sinking of ships like Shokaku echoes eternally, a reminder of courage, strategy, and the unseen forces that can shape the course of war.